In 1956, a Soviet military officer named Chaim Nashpitz walked away from everything he had known and everything he had built in the Soviet Union. He was an officer of SMERSH, the secret Soviet military police force that had conducted a campaign of terror and torture across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union itself. When he defected to the West, he brought with him testimony of crimes so horrific, so systematically organized, and so widespread that Western intelligence agencies realized they had finally penetrated the veil of Soviet secrecy. His story is not just about one man's conscience. It is about the confrontation between a totalitarian system built on terror and a democratic system built on law. It is about why totalitarian regimes eventually collapse and why free societies endure. And it is a story that Americans need to understand because it explains the origins of the Cold War and why the East Europeans who suffered under Soviet occupation will never forget what was done to them. The year is 1943. World War II is still raging in Europe. Nazi Germany is being pushed back on the Eastern Front by the advancing Soviet Red Army. And in Moscow, Joseph Stalin makes a strategic decision. He knows that as the Red Army pushes into Eastern Europe, it will come into contact with potential enemies. He knows that within the Red Army itself, there are officers who might be suspected of disloyalty. He knows that as Soviet forces occupy Nazi-held territory, they will encounter populations that might resist Soviet control. So Stalin creates a new organization, a new terror apparatus, specifically designed to deal with all of these threats. On April 19, 1943, SMERSH is officially established. The name means death to spies in Russian. The official purpose is counterintelligence, protecting the Red Army from German espionage and sabotage. But the real purpose is far more sinister. SMERSH will become the most brutal internal security organization in Soviet history. It will employ between 30 and 50,000 personnel. It will operate across the entire Soviet Union and in occupied Eastern Europe. And it will become one of the primary instruments through which Stalin consolidates his absolute control over the Soviet state and over the newly conquered territories of Eastern Europe. The head of SMERSH is a man named Viktor Abakumov. To understand Viktor Abakumov is to understand how totalitarian systems work. Abakumov was born in 1908. He was neither an ideologue nor a true believer in communism. He was a survivor. During Stalin's Great Purge in the late 1930s, when Stalin executed hundreds of thousands of Communist Party members and military officers on fabricated charges, Abakumov survived by demonstrating complete willingness to torture and execute anyone Stalin pointed at. He survived the purges not because of loyalty or belief, but because he was willing to do the work that the system required. When Stalin needed someone to lead SMERSH, he turned to Abakumov, and Abakumov accepted because it meant power, status, and access to Stalin himself. What was Abakumov like? He was not a distant administrator who gave orders from behind a desk. He was a hands-on torturer who personally participated in the interrogation and torture of prisoners. According to testimonies later gathered by Western intelligence, Abakumov would personally conduct interrogations at SMERSH headquarters at Lubyanka prison in Moscow. He would beat prisoners with his own hands. He would shout accusations at them. He would supervise their torture. He would order their execution. This was not an organization run from a distance. It was run by a man who actively participated in the brutality. By 1943 and 1944, SMERSH was expanding rapidly. The organization quickly developed a specialized internal structure. There was a main directorate in Moscow under Abakumov. There were regional commands across the Soviet Union, and there were specialized task forces that followed behind the Red Army as it advanced into Eastern Europe. These task forces had a specific mission: identify and eliminate potential enemies of Soviet control in the newly occupied territories. The mechanism by which SMERSH operated was refined over time, but the basic structure remained the same. When the Red Army conquered new territory, SMERSH teams would arrive and begin identifying targets. The targets could be many things: former Nazi collaborators, members of nationalist movements, Polish Home Army soldiers, Latvian or Lithuanian independence fighters, Ukrainian nationalists, clergy, intellectuals, wealthy landowners, anyone who might theoretically pose a future threat to Soviet control. Once identified, these targets would be arrested. The arrest process itself was designed to be terrifying. SMERSH operatives would arrive at night, typically, and take their target away without explanation. Families were often not told where their loved ones had been taken. The arrested would be transported to SMERSH interrogation centers, of which there were many scattered across Soviet territory and occupied Eastern Europe. These interrogation centers had one purpose: to extract confessions. The interrogation process at SMERSH facilities was based on systematic torture and psychological manipulation. According to a classified CIA document from 1956 titled Communist Interrogation, which analyzed the methods used by Soviet intelligence services, SMERSH interrogators used a variety of techniques. Sleep deprivation was standard. Prisoners would be kept awake for days at a time through continuous interrogation. They would be placed in isolation cells, sometimes so small that they could not lie down. The cells would be heated to unbearable temperatures or cooled to freezing cold. Bright lights would be kept on continuously. Food would be minimal and often withheld entirely. The psychological tactics were equally refined. Interrogators would accuse prisoners of crimes they had never committed. They would shout accusations repeatedly. They would claim to have evidence of guilt that did not exist. They would show prisoners false documents suggesting that other prisoners had confessed to implicating them. They would make threats against their family members. They would conduct mock executions, bringing prisoners to a courtyard, lining them up, and pretending to execute them, only to stop at the last moment and drag them back to their cell. The goal was to break the prisoner's will, to destroy his ability to distinguish reality from fiction, to make him so desperate to escape the torture that he would admit to anything.
One example from the historical record illustrates this process. A Soviet prisoner was interrogated repeatedly with the same questions over and over. Where did you get those military medals? Why did you allow yourself to be taken prisoner? What German task did you have? To every answer, the interrogator would shout, "You are lying, you Alsatian dog." The prisoner would be tortured, then interrogated again. The cycle would continue for days, weeks, sometimes months. Eventually, the prisoner's mind would break. He would confess to crimes he never committed. He would implicate others in conspiracies that never existed. He would sign a document admitting to espionage, or treason, or collaboration, or whatever the interrogators demanded. These false confessions had a purpose. Soviet authorities needed them for show trials and for documentation. They needed paper evidence of guilt to justify imprisonment or execution. The confessions themselves became the evidence of the crimes. It did not matter that they were extracted under torture and were therefore worthless as evidence. What mattered was that the Soviet state had documentation, and the Soviet state could use that documentation to justify whatever it wanted to do. The torture methods employed by SMERSH were diverse and systematic. There was physical torture, beatings with rubber truncheons and clubs, stress positions where prisoners would be forced to stand for hours in painful positions that caused circulation to be cut off, burnings with cigarettes, sexual torture, and humiliation. There was psychological torture, the isolation, the sleep deprivation, the constant interrogation, the threats. And there were experimental methods. Soviet intelligence services experimented with drugs to see if they could chemically induce mental states that would make prisoners more suggestible and more likely to confess. The result of this systematic torture was predictable. Over time, the torture victims would become what SMERSH interrogators called mentality dulled. Their ability to think clearly would be destroyed. They would lose the ability to distinguish between truth and fabrication. They would become utterly suggestible. They would accept whatever narrative the interrogators presented, and they would sign whatever confessions the interrogators demanded. By 1944 and 1945, as the Red Army conquered Eastern Europe, SMERSH expanded these operations dramatically. Polish Home Army soldiers who had fought first against Nazi Germany and then against Soviet occupation were captured by the thousands. They were brought to SMERSH interrogation centers. They were tortured until they confessed to crimes they had not committed. Many were executed. Some were sentenced to the Soviet Gulag labor camp system. All were broken and destroyed. The same process occurred across Eastern Europe. In the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, independence movements had fought for freedom. SMERSH viewed these fighters as enemies of Soviet control. They were arrested, tortured, and either executed or deported to Siberia. Entire families were taken. According to historical records, approximately 500,000 Balts were deported to Soviet labor camps during the post-war period. Many died in transit. Many more died in the camps themselves. In Ukraine, SMERSH conducted a systematic campaign against Ukrainian nationalists and independence activists. The pattern was identical: arrest, torture, forced confession, execution, or deportation. Thousands of Ukrainians were killed. Thousands more were sent to the camps. The goal was to eliminate any potential for Ukrainian nationalism or independence movement. But SMERSH's activities were not limited to occupied territories. Within the Soviet Union itself, SMERSH conducted a massive operation that affected millions of Soviet citizens. This operation was called the Filtration camps. As World War II ended, Soviet soldiers who had been captured by Nazi Germany and who had survived and been liberated by the advancing Allies began returning to Soviet territory. Soviet ideology taught that surrender to the enemy was treason. Therefore, any soldier who had been captured must be considered suspect. Any soldier who had survived captivity must be questioned about what they had done, what they had told the Germans, what they had collaborated on. All returning Soviet soldiers were sent to SMERSH filtration camps. These were facilities where they would be interrogated by SMERSH officers. The interrogation process was the same as in other facilities, torture-based, designed to extract confessions. The criteria for judgment were entirely subjective. SMERSH officers would decide whether a returning soldier was loyal or disloyal, whether he had collaborated with the Germans or not. The decisions were often arbitrary. A soldier might be cleared and sent back to service, but the majority were sent to the Soviet Gulag labor camps. Approximately 15% were executed immediately. The scale of this operation was enormous. Millions of Soviet soldiers passed through filtration camps. Hundreds of thousands were executed or imprisoned based on confessions extracted under torture. Many were sent to the harshest Gulag camps, where they would spend decades in frozen Siberian labor camps, dying from disease, starvation, and cold. One specific example illustrates the tragedy. A Soviet officer named Timofeyeva was liberated from German captivity on January 31, 1945. She was ordered to report to Landsberg for vetting by SMERSH. When she arrived, SMERSH operatives picked her up. They began interrogating her. Where did you get those military medals? Why did you allow yourself to be taken prisoner? What German task did you have? They tortured her through the night. By dawn, they had extracted a confession that she was a German agent. She was sent to the Gulag. She was innocent, but SMERSH had a confession that proved her guilt. That was all that mattered to the system. Another example from the historical record tells of a pilot named Laskin. While imprisoned at Sukhanovo prison, tortured by SMERSH interrogators, Laskin was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross by the American government for extraordinary heroism in combat. But while Laskin was being tortured in a Soviet prison, the American government did not know this. No one had told them that a man they were honoring for bravery was being tortured by the Soviet secret police. Laskin was ultimately imprisoned for years. He was charged with treason based on a false confession extracted under torture. He had done nothing wrong, but the Soviet state had documentation of his guilt, and that was sufficient. These stories could be multiplied thousands of times. For millions of Soviet citizens, SMERSH meant arrest, torture, false confession, and either execution or decades in the Gulag. The system was efficient, it was systematic, and it was entirely designed to consolidate Soviet control through fear and terror. But SMERSH was not limited to interrogation and torture. SMERSH was also directly involved in mass executions and what would today be called ethnic cleansing. One example stands out as particularly horrifying. On January 31, 1944, Stalin issued an order. The entire Chechen and Ingush populations of the North Caucasus were to be deported from their homeland to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. The reason given was that they had collaborated with Nazi Germany. The truth was more complex. Stalin feared any population that might have nationalist aspirations. He feared that the Chechens, with their long history of resistance to Russian imperial rule, might resist Soviet control. He feared that Islamic traditions in the Caucasus might resist Soviet atheism. So he ordered the complete deportation and removal of these populations. SMERSH was tasked with implementing this deportation. The deportation was conducted with extreme cruelty. SMERSH operatives and Soviet security forces herded Chechen and Ingush populations into trains and trucks. Those who could not be transported or who resisted were dealt with brutally. According to testimony from survivors and defectors, many Chechens and Ingush were burned alive. Others were buried alive. Still others were drowned in lakes. Hundreds of thousands were uprooted from their homeland and sent on a journey across Soviet territory to Central Asia. Many died in transit. Many more died in the camps themselves from disease, starvation, and cold. This was ethnic cleansing conducted by a modern state with modern efficiency, and SMERSH was instrumental in its execution. Similar patterns played out across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. The scope of SMERSH's operations was massive. Conservative estimates suggest that approximately 10 million people were affected by SMERSH's operations, whether through arrest, torture, interrogation, execution, or deportation. This number equals or exceeds the number of victims of the Nazi Holocaust. But while the Holocaust is extensively documented, studied, memorialized, and remembered, SMERSH's crimes are far less well known in the West. This is partly because Soviet secrecy prevented disclosure of these crimes during the Cold War. It is partly because the Soviet Union won the war and therefore was not held accountable for its crimes. And it is partly because Western governments during the Cold War were more interested in containing Soviet military power than in pursuing justice for Soviet war crimes. Understanding this context is essential to understanding what Chaim Nashpitz was and what he did. Nashpitz was an officer within this system. He served in SMERSH. He participated in this machinery of terror. He knew firsthand how the system worked. He had been trained in interrogation techniques. He had ordered arrests. He had participated in torture. He had witnessed executions. And he had carried out the will of the Soviet state. But something happened after World War II ended. The Soviet Union did not simply conclude its operations. Instead, Stalin became increasingly paranoid and increasingly brutal. The terror that had been focused on external enemies during the war was now turned inward toward Soviet society itself. Party members were arrested on fabricated charges, military officers were imprisoned, scientists, writers, and intellectuals were targeted. Stalin was conducting new purges, new waves of terror to consolidate his absolute power. This internal terror affected even the security apparatus itself. SMERSH officers who had served Stalin faithfully began to realize that they could be targeted. They knew of Lavrentiy Beria, the chief of the secret police under Stalin, and they knew that even Beria's position was not secure. They knew that at any moment they could be accused of a crime, arrested, tortured, and executed. And they knew that once arrested, their torture under SMERSH methods would be guaranteed because they themselves had developed and used those methods. Then, in March 1953, Joseph Stalin died. For a moment, the Soviet system appeared frozen, uncertain. Stalin had been the central figure, the supreme authority. With him gone, there was a power vacuum. Lavrentiy Beria, the chief of security, maneuvered to consolidate power. He began releasing political prisoners. He began suggesting reforms. He appeared to be attempting to move away from Stalin's terror. But Beria's consolidation of power lasted only a few months. In December 1953, Beria was arrested by a coalition of other Soviet leaders. He was tried in secret, and he was executed. His execution was a signal to the security apparatus. The old order has changed. Anyone who had served Stalin faithfully could face prosecution. Then, on December 19, 1954, Viktor Abakumov, the former chief of SMERSH, was executed. Abakumov had been arrested in 1951 on charges of fabricating false cases against senior Soviet officials. While imprisoned, he was tortured using the very methods he had pioneered. He was interrogated by officers using his own techniques. He was beaten and humiliated. And finally, he was executed. His execution was a statement: the architects of Stalin's terror would face justice. These executions created a window of opportunity for SMERSH officers. They understood that they were vulnerable. They understood that they could be arrested at any moment and subjected to the same torture and execution that Abakumov had experienced. They understood that the Soviet system, having used terror as its primary method of control, would now turn that terror on its own officials, and they understood that their only escape was to flee. In 1956, in this atmosphere of uncertainty and fear, Chaim Nashpitz made his decision. He would defect. He would leave the Soviet Union. He would escape to the West. He would offer everything he knew to Western intelligence services. His motivation was both practical and moral. Practically, he wanted to save his own life. He did not want to be arrested, tortured, and executed as Abakumov had been. But morally, he had also come to a realization. He had spent his adult life as an instrument of a terror system. He had participated in torturing people. He had ordered arrests. He had witnessed executions. And he no longer wanted to be part of that system. When Nashpitz defected to the West, he brought with him testimony of SMERSH's crimes. He provided detailed information about the organization's structure. He provided information about the interrogation and torture methods. He provided information about specific victims and perpetrators. He provided information about execution sites and burial locations. And he provided information about the scale of SMERSH's operations, the fact that approximately 50,000 personnel operated across 50 separate facilities, affecting millions of people. Western intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA and British MI6, were shocked by what they learned from Nashpitz and other SMERSH defectors. They had known that the Soviet system was brutal. They had suspected that Soviet intelligence agencies used torture, but they had dramatically underestimated the scale and systematicity of Soviet terror. Here was a high-ranking Soviet officer telling them that the Soviet Union had conducted a terror campaign involving 50,000 personnel, affecting 10 million people over a period of years. Here was someone testifying to systematic torture, forced confessions, mass executions, ethnic cleansing. Here was evidence that the Soviet Union was not just militarily powerful, but was fundamentally a totalitarian terror state, and SMERSH was instrumental in its execution. This understanding contributed to Western Cold War strategy. It reinforced the conviction that the Soviet system could not be reformed through negotiation. It reinforced the conviction that Soviet expansion had to be contained through military strength and political will. It reinforced the conviction that the East European populations under Soviet occupation were not content with Soviet rule, but were being held down by military force and terror. And it explained why when the Hungarians rebelled against Soviet rule in 1956, just months after Nashpitz's defection, the Hungarian uprising faced not negotiation, but Soviet tanks and brutal suppression. But Nashpitz's defection had another significance that went beyond strategic intelligence. It demonstrated something fundamental about totalitarian systems. It demonstrated that even within the machinery of oppression, conscience persists. Even a SMERSH officer, a man trained to torture, a man who had participated in atrocities, could reach a point where he said, "No more." Even a man embedded in the terror system could decide that the system was wrong. Even a man whose career depended on the continuation of totalitarianism could choose truth over loyalty. This is a pattern that repeated itself during the Cold War. Over and over, Soviet officials, security officers, military personnel, and scientists defected to the West. They came because they saw that the system was built on lies. They came because they realized that totalitarianism was evil. They came because they believed that the West offered something better, a system based on law, on rights, on human dignity, on truth. And when they came, they brought testimony that exposed the true nature of the Soviet system. The story of Chaim Nashpitz does not end simply with his defection. It continues with his family. Nashpitz had a son named Mark, born in approximately 1948. When Chaim defected in 1956, Mark was approximately 8 years old. Mark remained in the Soviet Union. He grew up without his father. He was raised as a child of a defector, which in Soviet society meant suspicion and stigma. His father's act of defection marked him as the child of a traitor. As Mark grew older, he became educated. He became a dentist. But he also became aware of the injustice of the Soviet system. He became a dissident. He began speaking out against Soviet authoritarianism. In 1983, Chaim Nashpitz, now an adult of approximately 27 years old, was arrested by Soviet authorities. He was tried in a closed court on charges of anti-Soviet activities. The Soviet authorities would not allow a public trial. They would not allow witnesses or defense. He was convicted of crimes related to his anti-Soviet statements and sentenced to 5 years in exile. The irony is almost unbearable. Chaim had escaped the Soviet system by defecting to the West. He had chosen freedom. Mark had remained in the Soviet system. But Mark was punished precisely because his father had chosen freedom. Mark was imprisoned because of his father's defection. The Soviet system extracted revenge on the son for the actions of the father. This was a manifestation of Stalin's most brutal policies, the concept of collective family punishment. If one member of a family was deemed an enemy of the state, the entire family could be punished. Eventually, after years of struggle, Mark was able to emigrate from the Soviet Union. Eventually, father and son were reunited. But those years, those decades of separation caused by the Iron Curtain, by the Cold War, by the Soviet system's refusal to allow people to choose their own destiny, represented the human cost of totalitarianism. They represented the ways in which totalitarian systems destroy families, lives, futures. The story of Chaim Nashpitz and his defection illustrates something that Americans need to understand about the Cold War. The Cold War was not simply a military competition between two superpowers. It was a confrontation between two fundamentally different systems. On one side was a system based on totalitarian control, on terror, on the suppression of truth, on the elimination of individual rights and freedoms. On the other side was a system based on law, on the protection of rights, on the opening of truth, on the belief that human beings should be free to choose their own destiny. And when they came, they brought testimony that exposed the true nature of the Soviet system. The Soviet system could build military power, it could build nuclear weapons, it could build intercontinental missiles, it could industrialize and modernize, but it could not retain the loyalty of its own officials when they were offered an alternative. It could not keep people who understood its true nature from defecting when they saw the possibility of escape. And ultimately, it could not sustain itself because it was built on lies, and lies, no matter how carefully guarded, eventually leak out. Americans sometimes struggle to understand why East Europeans have such deep distrust of Russia. Americans sometimes struggle to understand why Polish people, Lithuanian people, Ukrainian people all have historical grievances against Russia that seem to go beyond normal international competition. The answer lies in SMERSH. The answer lies in the terror campaigns. The answer lies in the fact that millions of East Europeans experienced Soviet occupation not as liberation, but as conquest. Not as freedom, but the replacement of one tyranny with another. When Chaim Nashpitz defected, he brought this history with him. He brought testimony to the atrocities that had been committed against East European populations. He brought evidence that Soviet occupation had been established through terror, through torture, through mass arrest and execution. And this testimony helped Americans understand that the Soviet system they were competing against was not a rational state that could be negotiated with or accommodated. It was a terror state that maintained control through fear, and that would continue to employ terror against anyone who threatened its authority. The Cold War was ultimately won not through military superiority alone, though American military power was crucial. The Cold War was won because the American system was fundamentally better. It was better because it was built on truth rather than lies, on law rather than terror, on freedom rather than control. Defectors like Chaim Nashpitz proved this. They left the Soviet system because they could see that it was evil. They came to the West because they could see that it offered something better. And their testimony helped convince the world that totalitarianism, no matter how powerful it appeared on the surface, was ultimately unsustainable. Chaim Nashpitz's defection in 1956 was one moment in a larger pattern, but it was a significant moment. It was a moment when a Soviet officer, trained in the methods of the terror state, decided that conscience was more important than loyalty. It was a moment when the secrets of SMERSH, carefully guarded behind the Iron Curtain, began to leak out to the West. It was a moment when the fiction of Soviet benevolence was shattered by testimony from someone who had been inside the machine. The story of Chaim Nashpitz and SMERSH is a story about the ultimate fragility of totalitarian systems. These systems appear powerful and invulnerable from the outside. They command large armies, control vast territories, employ millions of people in their security apparatus. But they are built on a fundamental lie, that the state is good, that the party is right, that the system is serving the people. And when anyone with knowledge and conscience escapes and tells the truth, the entire facade becomes questionable. This is why totalitarian systems fear defectors. This is why they pursue them so relentlessly. This is why, even decades after someone escapes, totalitarian systems will try to harm their families, will try to punish their relatives, will try to erase evidence of their crimes. Because defectors represent the greatest threats to totalitarianism, the threats of truth. In the end, truth prevailed. The Soviet Union, built on lies and maintained through terror, eventually collapsed. The SMERSH apparatus was dissolved, the torture centers were closed, the victims, though many remained uncompensated and unacknowledged, were at least freed from Soviet rule. And the testimonies of defectors like Chaim Nashpitz became part of the historical record, proof of the crimes that had been committed, evidence that totalitarianism is not a system for the future, but a relic of the past. The legacy of SMERSH and its crimes remains relevant today. In a world where authoritarianism is rising in various forms, where torture is practiced by some governments, where truth is under attack, the story of SMERSH reminds us what totalitarian systems look like, what they do, what they are capable of. It reminds us that the defenses of freedom, the protection of human rights, the rule of law, and the preservation of truth are not luxuries, they are necessities. They are what separates civilized systems from terror states, and they are what free people must be willing to fight for and protect. Chaim Nashpitz's defection was an act of conscience in a system designed to eliminate conscience. It was an act of courage in a system designed to inspire fear. And it contributed, in his own small way, to the ultimate victory of freedom over totalitarianism. His son, Mark, who suffered for his father's choice, eventually escaped to freedom as well. And the story that Nashpitz told, the testimony he gave, the truth he revealed, remains a permanent indictment of the Soviet terror system and a testament to the ultimate power of human conscience.